You know, when you look out your window, maybe you spot a famously ungraceful pigeon just completely crash landing into a branch. And you can't help but wonder, what does it actually feel? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating biological puzzle. For a long, long time, we've debated what's actually happening inside the minds of animals when they get injured. Do they experience the world the way we do, or are they basically just biological robots reacting to stimuli? We're going to dive deep into the science of avian pain today. And trust me, what researchers are discovering, it's going to completely change the way you look at our feathered friends.
So here's the million-dollar question. How do we actually know if animals feel pain when they literally can't tell us? It's a huge dilemma, right? In a lot of places, animal welfare laws just kind of assume birds are sentient. But traditionally, a lot of our claims about a bird's capacity for pain are just extrapolated from mammals. We basically say, well, a dog feels pain, a human feels pain, so a bird must too. But here's the catch. Avian brains are organized very, very differently than our brains. We can't just assume, we have to prove it. To do that, we first need a rock-solid definition of what we're actually looking for. Researchers Maloney and Kent hit the nail on the head here. They define pain as an aversive, sensory, and emotional experience representing an awareness by the animal of damage or threat to the integrity of its tissues. Now, I want you to focus on two words there, sensory and emotional. Pain isn't just a physical reaction to an injury, it's a dual process. You need the physical detection of damage, sure, but you also absolutely need that unpleasant emotional experience to truly call it pain. So here is our roadmap for this explainer. First up, reflex versus real pain. Second, we'll look at the avian sensory hardware. Third, proving the pain experience. And finally, why avian pain matters. Okay, let's jump right into part one. Reflex versus real pain, or as I like to think of it, hardware versus software. We can actually split this whole biological process into two distinct tabs. Think of it exactly like a computer. On one side, we have nociception. This is the hardware. It's the body's automatic, completely unconscious sensory system that detects damage. Imagine you touch a hot stove and your hand violently jerks back before your brain even registers that you're burned. That is nociception. But on the other side, we have pain. This is the software. It's the conscious, unpleasant, emotional experience that gets generated up in the brain. That software program is what gives an animal a long-lasting motivation to avoid getting hurt again in the future. Moving right along to section 2, the avian sensory hardware. How exactly do birds detect that damage in the first place? When mapping out the biological pathway, you can literally draw a dividing line between these two halves. Down below, you've got the nociceptors and the spinal cord. That's all nociception, pure hardware, operating totally unconsciously. The brain itself sits right on that border, bridging the gap up to the complex, learned behaviors, which represent actual conscious pain. This setup also perfectly explains where different painkillers do their work. Drugs like NSAIDs, think ibuprofen, and local anesthetics actually block those hardware signals down in the spinal cord and nociceptors. Meanwhile, opioids act much higher up, right where the brain and spinal cord meet. So how does this hardware actually fire? Well, it happens in 3 rapid-fire steps. Step 1 is transduction. A bird has these free nerve endings called nociceptors all over its skin, beak, and joints. When tissue gets damaged, these receptors detect it. Step 2 is transmission. Fast, sharp pain basically takes the express lane up the spinal cord using insulated nerves called A delta fibers. Dull, aching pain takes the slower, uninsulated route via C fibers. And then step 3 is the nociceptor reflex. The signal hits the spinal cord or brainstem and immediately triggers an unconscious automatic reflex to pull away from the danger. No complex thought required whatsoever. And that brings us to a literally mind-bending fact from the research. Are you ready for this? A chicken missing its forebrain can still execute coordinated escape behaviors. Just think about what that implies. You can have a bird that literally lacks the higher brain structures required to process conscious emotion, and it will still exhibit rapid withdrawal reflexes, increased heart rates, and blood pressure spikes when exposed to something noxious. Those responses are essentially just zombie-like automatic hardware firing off. They are absolutely not proof that the emotional software of pain is actually running. Which naturally brings us to section 3, proving the pain experience, the search for the software. Now, this was a massive puzzle for researchers. See, in mammals, we can just use neuroimaging to watch a whole network of cortical areas light up. It's what we call the pain matrix. But avian forebrains are architecturally totally different. They don't have this mammalian matrix. On top of that, when scientists hooked birds up to EEGs to measure their brainwaves during noxious stimulation, the results were just
incredibly inconclusive. Because a bird's relevant brain structures are buried much deeper than a mammal's, surface EEGs just can't pick up a clear global pain response. So scientists had to get creative. They had to look past brain scans and focus on complex behavioral tests instead. To prove the software exists, researchers started looking for behaviors that require complex integration, learning, and memory. Basically, they're looking for evidence that a bird is actively, cognitively weighing the unpleasantness of a stimulus against its other priorities in life. They look for things like spontaneous expression, like prolonged limping or fiercely guarding an injured area. They look for motivational trade-offs, attentional analgesia, and associative or relief learning. Let's look at some really wild examples of these in action.
Okay, let's talk about motivational trade-offs. In one study, researchers looked at broiler chickens that were lame with arthritic joints. They set up an obstacle course and put food on the far side. Now, as you'd expect, the lame birds were significantly slower to climb over the obstacles to get the food compared to healthy birds. But, and here's the game changer, when the lame birds were given an NSAID painkiller, their performance improved dramatically. This is incredible proof. It shows the chickens were actively choosing to protect their joints because it felt bad, weighing that discomfort against their own hunger. Once the pain was chemically relieved, the motivation to eat won out.
Another genuinely fascinating phenomenon is attentional analgesia. It turns out that a sudden shift in a bird's focus or its environment can actually trigger its brain to produce endogenous opioids, basically its own natural painkillers. Researchers found that a strong motivation to prepare for laying an egg actually suppressed arthritis-related pain behavior in hens. The bird essentially hits mute on its own pain software so it can focus on a far more critical biological task. And we know this for sure because when scientists administered a drug called naloxone, which blocks opioid receptors, the pain behaviors immediately came right back. And finally, we have associative learning. If you really want to know if an animal is experiencing negative emotions, see if it learns to seek out relief. In one study, laying hens with healed keel fractures, which is a notoriously painful condition, were given an opioid painkiller in a very specific location. Later on, when given a choice, these hens showed a clear preference for hanging out in the location they associated with the pain relief. Healthy hens without fractures, they didn't care. They showed no preference at all. This is incredibly compelling evidence of relief learning. It proves beyond a doubt that these birds have the cognitive capacity to remember the emotional relief of analgesia. The software is absolutely running. All right, moving into our final section, Section 4, why avian pain matters. Let's talk about the real-world impact. To truly grasp the stakes here, we have to look at the difference between acute and chronic pain. Acute pain is short-lived, it's caused by immediate damage, and it mostly just triggers temporary reflexes. You get hurt, you flinch, you heal. But chronic pain? That's what happens when those nociceptive pathways we talked about become severely sensitized. The pain literally outlasts the original injury. It causes hyperalgesia, where things feel extra, unnecessarily painful, or allodynia, where even just a totally normal touch is excruciating. Chronic pain is the kind of pain that causes serious, long-term detrimental impacts to a bird's mental welfare and its everyday behavior. And unfortunately, the reality is that birds are exposed to a massive variety of pain sources. Out in the wild or with our pets, we're talking predator attacks or vehicle collisions. But in agricultural production systems, it includes standard husbandry procedures like debeaking, or conditions stemming from intense breeding and management, things like keel fractures, severe osteoarthritis, and foot pad dermatitis. We are talking about millions upon millions of birds routinely experiencing conditions that we now definitively know generate a complex, highly unpleasant emotional experience. And the hidden costs of this unmitigated chronic pain, they're staggering. When a bird is in constant pain, its entire behavior alters. It feeds less, which obviously decreases productivity. But deeper than that, prolonged physiological stress causes a massive metabolic shift. The bird's body will literally sacrifice its own growth, its immune system, and its reproductive functions just to redirect energy to dealing with the pain. Ethically, economically, and from a conservation standpoint, chronic pain is a full-blown crisis because it forces a stress response that essentially shuts down an animal's basic survival and social functions. But here's the kicker. Despite everything we just went over, we still have so much work to do. Check out this statistic. Scientists have only studied nociception and pain in about 15 of the estimated 10,000 bird species on Earth. That is a massive, glaring gap in our scientific understanding.
The vast majority of our research has only been done on chickens and pigeons. There is an incredibly urgent need for wider research across the entire avian class to truly understand how different species process these experiences.
Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on. The science clearly tells us that birds possess both the sensory hardware to detect damage and the complex cognitive software to suffer from it emotionally. They feel it. So, if birds experience the emotional software of pain just like we do, how should that change the way we treat the literally billions of birds in our food systems, our research labs, and our own homes? It's a pretty profound ethical question, and honestly, one that the science says we can no longer ignore. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.